Okay, so tariffs, they seem pretty straightforward, right? Like just a tax you put on stuff coming into a country.
Yeah, you would think so.
But then you have like a global powerhouse, a country like the US deciding to slap these tariffs on a huge trading partner like India.
Right.
The effects, I mean, the ripple effects of something like that can be massive and not always what you'd expect.
Hmm.
So that's what we're really going to dig into today. The whole story behind these Trump administration tariffs that they put on India, specifically the ones back in April 2025.
Uh,
Our goal is to go deeper than just the headlines and really figure out what went down and more importantly, like what it all means.
yeah, that's key because we're talking about a very specific moment in time, right?
Mm.
April 2025. And you had this whole America First trade philosophy that was really driving things back then.
Right.
And that was bumping up against this really significant and growing trade relationship between the U.S. and India.
Exactly. Like these two economies were already pretty intertwined before these tariffs even hit. So any kind of big policy change like this was bound to shake things up in some interesting ways.
For sure.
So today we're basically on a mission, to unpack all of this for you. We'll break down exactly what these tariffs were all about, look at the immediate impact, and then really get into the nitty-gritty of how different sectors of the Indian economy were affected.
Okay.
We also need to understand, what was the U.S. even thinking, right? What was their reasoning? How did India respond? And we'll even touch on the whole political and diplomatic side of things.
Hmm.
And then finally, we'll zoom out a bit, look at the big picture, the long-term economic implications, and see how India's experience stacked up against other countries that were also dealing with U.S. tariffs at the time.
Right.
So by the end of this whole thing, you should have a much clearer picture of this complex issue without feeling like you just sat through a boring economics lecture.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that we're not just talking about numbers here, right?
Mm.
We're talking about real world stuff.
Yeah.
These policies, they affect businesses, jobs, and what people are paying for everyday things.
For sure.
So if we can understand all the little details, it helps us see the bigger economic and political forces that are at play.
Okay, so let's dive into the nuts and bolts, the tariffs themselves. Our sources keep mentioning this thing called a reciprocal tariff. What exactly does that mean?
So a reciprocal tariff, it's basically a tool a country uses to try to, well, to encourage what they see as fairer trade.
Okay.
It's when a country says, hey, you're putting high tariffs on our stuff, so we're going to put tariffs on yours.
Got it.
It's not always a direct tit for tat, like responding to a specific tariff,
Yeah.
but more of a way to try to level the playing field.
Okay, that makes sense. So when these tariffs on India were first announced back in April 2025, what was the initial rate they were talking about?
Well, initially there was talk of a 27% tariff on goods from India, but then the White House ended up revising that and setting it at 26% for India specifically.
26%. Okay, and this wasn't just like a one-time thing, right?
No, it wasn't. They actually rolled it out in two phases.
3 phases. Okay, break that down for us.
So the first phase started on April 5th, 2025. They put a baseline 10% tariff on basically everything coming in from India, but with some exceptions,
Right.
which we'll get to. Then just 4 days later, on April 9th, they added that extra 16% to reach the 26% total for most goods, again, with some exceptions.
So 10% across the board, and then bam, another 16% on top of that.
Exactly. And here's the thing. These new tariffs weren't happening in a vacuum. Indian goods were already subject to existing U.S. tariffs, like the 25% on steel, aluminum, and car parts that they put in place earlier.
Oh, right. So those industries were already getting hit.
Exactly. So this was like a double whammy for them.
Ouch. You mentioned exceptions to these new tariffs. What kind of stuff got a pass?
This is where you start to see some strategy at play. Pharmaceuticals were a big one. They didn't want to mess with that because a lot of U.S. medications come from India.
Right.
Then you had some critical minerals, the stuff they need for tech and defense. Energy products and bullion precious metals were also exempt.
Makes sense. They didn't want to hurt their own industries too much.
Right? It was definitely a balancing act trying to push America first, but not shoot themselves in the foot.
Okay, so what was the immediate reaction when these tariffs were announced, especially from Indian businesses and the government?
Well, you can imagine there was a lot of concern, especially among Indian exporters. They were worried about staying competitive in the U.S. market if their stuff suddenly became a lot more expensive.
Yeah.
And the experts were all over the place with their predictions. Some said India could lose $7 billion in exports. Others said it could be as high as $30 billion.
Wow, that's a huge range.
It just shows how unpredictable these big trade policy moves can be.
Yeah.
It's hard to know exactly how everything will play out.
So which industries were freaking out the most?
A few key ones were right in the line of fire. Gems and jewelry.
Mm,
There was a big export for India to the U.S. They were expecting a major hit. Then you had smartphones and solar panels, both growing industries that were suddenly facing a lot more uncertainty.
right.
And of course, the auto parts industry, which we already talked about, they were bracing for even tougher times.
Okay, so a lot of immediate anxiety. Let's break it down sector by sector and see how these tariffs were projected to play out. Starting with agriculture. What did the experts think?
This is interesting. Agriculture was actually expected to be relatively unscathed.
Really?
Yeah, some even thought certain products like seafood and rice might actually get a boost.
Wait, how does that work?
Well, if other countries that export those things to the U.S. were hit with even higher tariffs, then Indian seafood and rice would suddenly look more appealing because they'd be relatively cheaper.
Ah, I see.
But it wasn't all sunshine and roses for Indian agriculture. Some products were still going to face challenges.
Okay, so kind of a mixed bag. What about manufacturing?
Manufacturing is more complicated. Let's start with textiles and apparel. Here's where it gets kind of surprising. This sector was actually looking at a potential increase in competitiveness.
Hold on. You're saying tariffs could actually help them?
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is, some of India's main competitors in textiles like Vietnam and Bangladesh,
Hmm.
they were hit with even higher tariffs from the U.S.
Oh,
So all of a sudden, Indian textiles and apparel could be more attractive to U.S. buyers because they'd be relatively cheaper.
that is a twist.
It shows you how these trade policies can have weird ripple effects.
All right.
You don't always just punish the country you're targeting.
That's a great point.
Well,
Okay, so textiles might benefit. What about electronics?
not so good.
Yeah.
For things like smartphones and solar panels, the outlook was pretty negative.
Yeah.
The tariffs would make them more expensive in the U.S. market, so that could slow down their growth.
And what about those big Indian exports, gems and jewelry?
Yeah, that was a major concern. They were expecting a big hit, potentially a serious drop in exports to the U.S.
That's rough for such a key sector.
Hmm.
And we talked about auto components. What was the prediction there?
A lot of uncertainty, basically.
Mhm.
These new tariffs on top of the existing ones created a lot of headwinds for Indian auto parts exporters.
Okay, so more trouble for them. What about steel and aluminum? Weren't those hit hard too?
Actually, they were exempt from
Oh.
the new reciprocal tariffs. They
Yeah.
were already under that 25% tariff from before.
Oh.
So they at least didn't get hit with any more increases.
So a little bit of good news, I guess. Now, what about India's tech industry? They're huge in IT services. Would they feel the pain?
This is an important point. The tariffs were specifically on goods, physical things. The IT sector in India mostly provides services, not goods.
Right.
So they were unlikely to be directly affected,
Hmm.
but there could be indirect effects. If the tariffs hurt the U.S. economy overall, then that could lead to less demand for Indian IT services.
So like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And finally, pharmaceuticals. Remember they got that exemption?
Yeah.
That was a huge win for India. This is a really important export sector for them, and avoiding those new tariffs was a big relief.
Okay, so some winners and losers across the Indian economy. Some sectors might even come out ahead, which is pretty surprising. Now let's shift gears and look at the U.S. side of things. Why did the Trump administration decide to do this in the first place? What was their thinking?
Well, their main argument was about the trade imbalance.
Mm.
They said India had really high tariffs on stuff coming in from the U.S., so they wanted to even things out.
Right, the whole reciprocal tariff idea.
Exactly. They said India had a tariff rate of like 52% on U.S. products, but that number was actually disputed by organizations like the WTO, who had much lower figures.
Interesting. So even what counts as high tariffs can be up for debate.
Yeah, different ways of measuring and interpreting things.
Yeah.
And beyond the trade imbalance, they also talked about protecting American industries, creating jobs in the U.S., and encouraging other countries to lower their own trade barriers.
So a lot of different goals all rolled into one big policy. So how did they come up with the specific numbers like that? 26% for India. Was there some kind of formula?
They basically looked at the trade deficit with each country and the total value of imports coming in from that country.
Okay, so a big picture approach. Now let's talk about India's response. What did they do when these tariffs hit?
They took a very measured approach.
Okay.
They didn't immediately fire back with their own tariffs. Instead, they focused on talking things out with the U.S., trying to negotiate a better deal.
So a diplomatic strategy.
Exactly.
Hmm.
They also started looking at free trade agreements with other countries. This was a way to diversify their trade relationships and not be so reliant on the U.S.
Smart move. And did they join any kind of global effort to push back against these U.S. tariffs?
It doesn't seem like they did.
Yeah.
They really preferred to handle things one-on-one with the U.S.
Interesting. Okay, so a lot of emphasis on diplomacy. Now, what about the bigger picture? The political and diplomatic impact on the U.S.-India relationship.
This is where it gets complicated. Remember how President Trump kept calling Prime Minister Modi a good friend?
Yeah.
But at the same time, he was slapping these tariffs on India? It shows how tricky international relations can be. You can have these trade disputes going on, but still have other important ties.
It's like saying, you're my buddy, but you're also costing me money.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the fact that they kept negotiating a trade deal even after the tariffs shows how much they valued the overall relationship.
Right, they had other shared interests like defense and security.
Exactly. Those things were too important to let a trade war ruin everything.
Hmm.
So even though there was some friction, they didn't let it derail the whole relationship.
Okay, so they kept talking. Now, what about the long-term economic implications for India? What did the experts predict?
There were a lot of different opinions. Some thought the impact on India's economy wouldn't be that bad. They pointed to things like the exemptions for certain sectors, the potential boost for textiles, and India's efforts to find new trading partners.
So a more optimistic view.
Yeah. Others were more worried, especially about those sectors we talked about earlier that were going to be hit hard, like gems and jewelry and electronics. If those industries struggled in the long run, it could definitely hurt India's overall economy.
And what about the long-term outlook for the U.S.?
Well, some people were concerned that the tariffs could backfire.
Yeah.
They might lead to higher prices for American consumers, and businesses could end up paying more for things they need from India. There were also worries that it could hurt U.S. economic growth.
And wasn't the whole point to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S.? Did they think that would actually happen?
That was definitely the goal. But whether it would actually work in the long run was a big question mark. It all depended on a lot of different factors, like how long the tariffs stayed in place, how the global trade landscape changed, and how both countries responded over time.
So a lot of uncertainty about the future. Okay, so let's zoom out even further and compare India's experience to other countries that were hit with these reciprocal tariffs. What was the big picture?
So India's tariff rate of 26% was actually right in the middle compared to other major U.S. trading partners. The EU had 20%, Japan had 24%, China had 34%, and Vietnam had a whopping 46%.
Wow. So India wasn't even the worst off.
And the impact varied a lot from country to country.
Hmm.
China, for example, had additional tariffs on top of the reciprocal ones, and they retaliated pretty strongly, which led to a much bigger trade war. Countries like Japan and South Korea, which export a lot of cars and electronics, they also got hit pretty hard because those industries were specifically targeted. And the EU being a big economic bloc, they were worried about the impact on the whole global economy.
And India had that potential advantage in textiles because their competitors got hit with even higher tariffs.
Yeah, that was a unique situation.
Yeah.
So you can see how the different tariff rates and the different economies of these countries led to a wide range of outcomes. It wasn't just a simple everyone loses situation.
Okay, so a very complex global picture. So as we wrap up here, what are the main takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the big one is that India did face some real challenges from these U.S. tariffs, but it wasn't a total disaster.
Right.
Some sectors actually stood to benefit, and India's response was very strategic. They focused on diplomacy and finding new trading partners.
And it shows how these trade policies can have really complicated consequences.
For sure, what seems like a simple solution can actually create a whole bunch of new problems and unexpected outcomes.
So it's a good reminder to look beyond the headlines and really understand all the different angles.
Absolutely.
So for all of you listening out there, what do you think was the most significant long-term outcome of these tariffs? Was it economic, political, or something else entirely? And how do you think this whole experience might shape global trade in the future? It's definitely something to ponder.
Yeah, a lot to think about.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of tariffs.
Always a pleasure.
And we'll catch you next time.
See you then.